everybody, and welcome to the Cork Harbour Festival, the future of port cities post-pandemic, recovery, resilience and renaissance. Quite a lot to get in there. I just want to welcome friends from Cork, from civil society in Cork, the public sector, private sector, and from various representative organisations and colleagues of mine in Cork City Council, along with our international delegates who are attending today as well. Particular welcome, I understand 20 countries have signed up to attend this particular discussion on the future of port cities, that I'm very much looking forward to. As we all know, the event is run as part of the Universities Across Europe City Partnership, the UNIC, which covers 8 port cities across Europe. And it's a relationship that stimulates a conversation to find solutions on post-industrial, I suppose, port cities and where we can go and how we can develop and what we can learn from each other. It's particularly relevant to Cork. I grew up in Cork at a time when it was very reliant on old style manufacturing. Members of my family lost their jobs in Ford and Dunlop. But since then, you've seen considerable change in the economy of Cork, where we now host a wide range of clusters, and the growth in foreign investment in indigenous enterprises is exponential over the last 10 years. But we're trying to do that in a way that's sustainable and that we hold on to the uniqueness of Cork. And we'll hear more about the development of Cork Port from Conor Mowlds later on. But the thing about Cork, I suppose, is that, you know, it's important for us to learn from international experience and to understand what other cities are going through. Cork is an ambitious city. We have very ambitious growth targets for the next 20 years, but it's backed by government commitment under the National Development Plan. And in fact, there's already about 1.7 billion euro of government investment committed and in the bag, if you like, for Cork to achieve our targets. We need to do this with private sector confidence and full engagement with stakeholders. And the purpose of the growth really is to make sure that we have the critical mass that we can, that can provide excellence in services, whether it's transport, health, culture, etc., that you have that critical mass and diversity to attract that type of investment. That means the quality of life for people can improve. I just want to thank, I suppose, UCC for organising today's event, in particular Jane Sinderman-Law and Joye along with Ciara O'Halloran and Martin Gavin. And I also want to welcome our speakers. But before I do that, we're delighted to hear from Síofra Thornton, who is a student of harp and singing in UCC and is currently doing research on the Irish harp. And she has performed nationally and internationally with the Ned Kelly's In Tune for Orchestra and the Irish Harp Orchestra. So maybe we just listen and enjoy Síofra. Síofra, it's a real pleasure to have live music, even though it'd be even more pleasure if we were all in the same room to enjoy it. But go ahead, Síofra. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Fearghal. It's an absolute delight to be here, especially after the year we have. It's been really, really hard for musicians, but please God, we're on the kind of other side of it and we'll be back to normal soon. So I suppose I'll get into it. I'm going to play a slow air from the Carriga Holt area. It's called Undonal Bui. And I'm going to follow that with 2 jigs. The first one is called The Lark in the Strand. And I got this from the playing of the great harper Michelle Mulcahy. And then I'm going to play Whelan's Old Sow as well, which I actually got from Michelle as well. So I'll give it a go and I hope you enjoy it. I'll just mute myself there.
Síofra, that was absolutely beautiful. I hope you can hear all the virtual applause. It's really lovely. Yeah, it's absolutely beautiful. Yeah.
Bravo, bravo, Síofra. Thank you very much for that. And I think there are loads of feet tapping here, but unfortunately you can't see it. So hopefully we'll all get back to live entertainment as soon as possible. I neglected to introduce myself and why I'm here. I'm Fearghal Reidy. I'm Director of Strategic and Economic Development with Cork City Council. And we're currently developing a plan, and this is why we're engaging and so involved in the initiative that with UCC, we're involved in developing a plan for Cork that looks at regeneration of the Cork lands, supporting the Port of Cork move to the harbour, and development of hopefully what will be a very exciting regeneration project for Europe in the city, a town within the city. I'd like to introduce the chair. You've already heard from Lorna Siggins, who is a reporter and an author of a number of books, including Mayday, Mayday, Everest Calling, and Once Upon a Time in the West. And I think, Lorna, I think that speaks to your love, I suppose, of all things sea and nature, etc. The speakers today, or the panelists today, is Conor Mowlds from the Port of Cork, Joye from the Port of Dublin, and Amanda Brandellero, I hope I pronounced that right, Amanda, from Erasmus University, Rotterdam. And again, thank you all very much for speaking today and for participating in this panel discussion. And I look forward to hearing it. Over to you, Lorna.
Just unmute myself there. Hope everyone can hear me. Yes, thanks very much, Fearghal. And again, thanks very much, Síofra, for this beautiful introduction to this conference. So, yeah, I suppose if COVID has exposed a lot of our infrastructural weaknesses, both here and across the globe, it's also exposed or highlighted some strengths. And in supply chains, our ports, the importance of our ports being so taken for granted. I often, when I'm following the debate about Dublin Port, and I know Lara's going to talk about this later, and economists periodically come on and say, why don't we just move Dublin Port? We need all that land for housing. And I think, okay, yeah, there's a lot of land there, but there's an awful lot of things that Dublin Port is doing with that property too. So it's like ports sometimes seem to be very invisible to people, but our cities grew out of our ports. And you don't have to be a sort of a history nerd or know all about the Hanseatic League to know about the importance of our ports. And I suppose as our ports grew and as the size of ships grew, and all that. Sorry about that. Maybe there was a slight, there was a tendency for a disconnect then between ports and the cities that grew out of those ports. And that's, I suppose, something that we will be talking about more today. So we have a very, very distinguished panel. As Fearghal was explaining, we have, I'll just give you a little bit more detail about our panel. So Conor Mowlds, Chief Commercial Officer of the Port of Cork, responsible for the development and implementation of the port's commercial strategy. He's held a variety of seagoing and shore positions in both the public and private sector in both Britain and Ireland, and most recently serving as head of college at the National Maritime College of Ireland in the most important city of Cork, in Ringaskiddy. And Conor has held a seat as a council member on the board of the Irish Chamber of Shipping also. He's a graduate of Maritime Business and Law and a fellow of the Institute of Logistics and Transport. Joye is Port Heritage Director of Dublin Port, and he's responsible for the Port Archive, covering 3 centuries of Dublin's history and more. Previously, he curated the award-winning Soldiers and Chiefs, the Irish Soldier at Home and Abroad from 1550, an exhibition at the National Museum of Ireland. He played a key role in the decade of commemorations from 2012 to 2017. He represented the National Museum on the Irish Battlefield Commission, the Moore Street Project, the GPO Witness History Museum, and he was historical advisor for Unpust's 2016 commemorative stamp series. More recently, he has partnered with the theatre company Anu Productions on 4 plays. He's a member of the Irish Film Institute's Newsreels project, the Irish Independence Film Collection, and is a graduate of UCD, Leicester University, and the Getty Leadership in California. Amanda Brandellero is Associate Professor at the Erasmus School of History, Culture and Communications in Rotterdam. She's a founding member of the Port City Futures, which she'll talk about, and that's a multidisciplinary research group focusing on contemporary port city challenges and opportunities, and her research focuses on sustainable and circular making practices. So without more ado, I'm going to ask each of the panelists to give a contribution of about 10 minutes on their various fields of expertise. So I'm going to start with you, Conor, for the Port of Cork.
Thank you very much, Lorna. Very much appreciate your very kind introduction. It's going to be probably difficult for me to follow Síofra after such beautiful music, but I'll certainly try my best. I'm going to start off today with my contribution with a brief set of 12 slides. So if you just bear with me, I'll attempt to use technology and share my slides with the group. So everyone can see that. It might take a little while for it to happen. I'll take it. Can I take it? That's, people can see where we're going now. That's fantastic. So as I mentioned, I'm delighted to have the opportunity to join this panel today and to speak on what I feel is a very interesting topic, the post-pandemic recovery, resilience and renaissance. So over the next 12 slides, and indeed in the conversation afterwards, I'm going to try and highlight how the Port of Cork has and is playing its part in the socio-economic resilience and renaissance and indeed resurgence of Cork as a port city, and indeed through the Port of Cork. But so before I do that, maybe for those of you who don't know that much about the Port of Cork, just to give you a snapshot as to who we are. We are a Tier 1 port of national significance, and we incorporate both the operation of the Port of Cork in Cork Harbour and indeed Bantry Bay Port Company, which comes under our management. In terms of the port itself, we operate off all of the 6 shipping modes. In terms of size, and this is important as I develop the concept and the discussion through the presentation. At the moment, we turn over about 30 million and just over 9 million tonnes in trade traffic, but they're significant figures when we talk about the impact that the pandemic has had upon us. And about 250,000 TEUs through our container operations. So that's who we are, and that's our size, with 150 members of staff at present. To get into the core of the topic today, recovery, resilience, and renaissance, I've decided to approach it in that very manner, using those three descriptors to articulate the Port of Cork's contribution. So firstly, to recovery. And when I thought about where the Port of Cork made its contribution to recovery, and indeed ports in general, I kept going back to more pre-recovery. And what I mean by that is and as any medic will tell us, the most important thing to support recovery when it comes to a patient, and the patient in this instance being Ireland, and particularly the southern region when it comes to Cork, is to keep that patient's pulse going so that it can support eventual recovery. And that's exactly what the Port of Cork, and indeed every port, does. It keeps the pulse going when we are exposed to extraordinary negative events such as COVID in this instance. So throughout COVID and up to now, no days were lost in trade. The Port of Cork kept going and facilitated that trade through really quite significantly difficult times. And to put it into context, in 2019, immediately before the pandemic, we ran at about 40 million in turnover. We took a 10 million hit. Literally, our business dropped off a cliff when COVID hit, and we had significant issues, negative issues in places like Ropax ferries, and indeed cruise dropping off a cliff completely. So it's very difficult to run your business when you've lost such revenue so quickly. And in terms of tonnage, we lost over 1 million tons. And to put it into context, of value context, exports from the Port of Cork run at about 20 billion, imports about 10 billion. So that will give you an idea of how much the region depends, and that goes very much to Lorna's comments earlier on, how valuable ports are, particularly to an island nation like Ireland, but particularly to the cities that are built and grown up around those ports. So from a recovery position, we kept that pulse going, and that's allowed us to be in a position to recover. In terms of resilience, I think I've broken this down into two areas, climatic and geopolitical. And if we look at the climatic piece, certainly we're all keenly aware of the impacts and continuing impact of global warming and the effects that's bringing. But if we look at some of the significant issues that the world has faced, the port, again, has operated throughout them. Stormophilia, as an example of quite an extreme climatic event. But in general terms, the Port of Cork, and indeed other ports, are exposed to significant events, snow events, flooding events, regular wind and issues, and yet we continue to trade. In fact, the motto of the Port of Cork, Statio Bene Fide Carinus, means a safe harbour for ships. And that's something that we pride ourselves on and have continued to trade irrespective of whatever climatic conditions we've faced, and indeed no downtime during those hard times. From a geopolitical perspective, certainly in the last 18 months, we have faced two very significant geopolitical events at the same time, both COVID and Brexit. COVID obviously is a main driver behind the conversations we'll have today, but Brexit has been quite a significant issue for us to deal with. The planning pre-Brexit took quite a lot of time. No one really understood whether it would happen at one stage, or if it did happen, if the land bridge through the UK, our traditional route to market in Europe and back, would be closed off. And so we had a lot of planning issues and preparatory issues to put ourselves in position for. But our response to that has been to maintain and indeed grow our links to the EU. And so in the last 18 months, not only have we developed the first transatlantic direct route by sea for cargo to the US from Cork through ICL, but we've also developed direct routes to Europe, both to Zeebrugge and indeed to Antwerp. And so we've maintained and grown that connectivity that actually wasn't there before from Ro-Ro and Conroe, but was actually on Lolo only. And so maintaining that connectivity has been hugely important, those trade links to our European partners. In terms of the Renaissance part, this is a fantastic time for Cork and indeed the Port of Cork, because Renaissance is a huge part of what we're doing. Fearghal referred to it earlier on in terms of our move from being what we are now, which is a mix but predominantly a river port, and moving to a modern deepwater seaport. So what you see in front of you here is a chart outlining our city quays, where we operate now at the moment still, through to Tivoli, our primary container terminal. And then as we move downriver to Merino Point, our new flagship facility for bulk, and then down into where we'll end up in Ringaskiddy as a deep sea multimodal port, both for Lolo and indeed for Ro-Ro. And you'll notice on this chart, I've listed the depths, because these are primary drivers, because as the ships get bigger, we can no longer maintain longer term our operations in the center of those cities at those depths. But what that gives rise to is the resurgence and the revitalization of those areas as we move out of them. And we'll talk a little bit about that as I move through these slides. And just to articulate it in picture view, this is the same chart again, but with those facilities, the city quays, which we've left our traditional headquarters in the Customs House. We left that in January of this year. Tivoli, which is still a hugely important Lolo port for us, and indeed a liquid cargo port, but a river port nonetheless. And then where we'll move to longer term in Ringaskiddy, which is a deep water facility. So the Renaissance part is hugely important to us. And the Renaissance means that we need to work with our partners, the City Council, the national agencies, so we can develop the MPF and also help see that City Council vision for both the North and the South docklands. And the National Planning Framework of 2040 sets out the government's ambition for sustainable growth in Ireland. And that's translated to action at regional and local level. And the MPF 2040 envisages a huge population growth for Ireland, so approximately 1 million. So it's about 4.6 at the moment, growing to about 5.6 million in 2040. And the regional urban centres, particularly Cork, will have a huge part to play in that, to ensure that the growth is sustainable and balanced. And also the MPF 2040 addresses the decline in inner urban population, particularly in Cork in recent years. And so the Cork docks and the Tivoli docks will have a huge part to play as growth enablers in that respect. I mean, Cork City is targeted for, believe it or not, up to 50% growth by 2040. So they're very ambitious targets, and we hope that the Port of Cork, in cooperation with the city and indeed the county, will be able to make our contribution towards that. I mentioned earlier on the fact that we moved out of our traditional headquarters, the Customs House in the Port of Cork, and we left that in January of this year. We sold it to Terra Holdings. And what you see in front of you here are a number of pictures which show what it was like in the 50s, what it was like when we left it ourselves in January, and some of the very innovative and progressive ideas that Terra Holdings have to render both the Customs House and also the bond warehouses, which were built by Napoleonic prisoners of war around the 1800s, into modern and exciting buildings which will help revitalise the centre of the city. For our part, our plans are to revitalise and regenerate the Tivoli docklands as we move out of Tivoli, as we move our container terminal out of where it currently is and our liquid cargo out and downriver to Marino Point and to the Deepwater Harbour. We see a huge opportunity to develop the Tivoli land bank, and to do that we've engaged with leaders in the field, Reidys and Tyrrans. They put together for us a master plan back in 2019, and in so doing, we've also looked at best practice around the world for this type of regeneration in cities. Hammarby in Stockholm, Hamburg, Cape Town and Salford. Hammarby in particular, we sent a team to Hammarby to see how Stockholm City Council worked with the authorities and developed the Royal Seaport. So using industry best practice globally as a benchmark for how we will develop the Tivoli land bank. And I think really for us, that's where we will make a huge contribution in this area, as Tivoli will become a sustainable urban neighbourhood. We have used key vision concepts, which you see here, that will integrate the site into its unique water front setting. Each of the vision concepts which I've listed here in front of us embody modern urban design and landscape and architectural thinking. And we believe that this vision that we have will help bring Tivoli to a truly successful and resilient community, where people will want to live, will want to work, and will want to relax. And that would be a huge success for us as we develop and leave a legacy behind us, a maritime legacy certainly, but we leave a legacy behind us as we move out of a sustainable city environment. And finally, I'll finish off with the future for the Port of Cork. So for us, the future could be very different from what it's been, particularly in terms of energy. We see that as a growing area, and the offshore renewable industry in particular. But it's also for us finding that balance as we get to net zero of supporting all of the stakeholders as we move and we embrace energy as a contributor to us, but also ensuring that we move to net zero in a sustainable fashion. Green ports is definitely the future. So every port will move towards that green port realisation. We'll open our new €86 million investment container terminal. And then we'll hopefully see a return of cruise, which makes a huge contribution, not just to the port itself, but particularly to tourism and the businesses in the region. And we've seen that loss of cruise over COVID is something that we really need to see replaced, and hopefully 22 will see a return of that. And then our continued move towards port digitalisation, which itself is intrinsically linked to the green ports. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Conor. It was really interesting. So Lara, would you like to speak from the Dublin perspective?
I will, Laura, thank you very much. Just see if I can set this up. Do you see that?
Yeah.
Again, like Conor, I'm just going to go for about 10 minutes just to give some context about Dublin Port, look at where it's come from, and then to look and focus very much on our citizen-centred and diverse and ecological approach that we're taking. Like Cork, we've gone through very much a renaissance over the last couple of years. The port itself is a very, very busy port. 50% of imports and exports into Ireland come through the port, and that is really down to geography, that the ships and people importing in particular want to come to the centre where the large population is. The port itself has been around since 1707 in various guises. The modern port itself is now called Dublin Port Company, and like Cork, it's very much a landlord port. We are there to facilitate all the various companies working inside the port, and that's our key role. Prior to 1977, the port was involved in every aspect of the port. That's changed. Again, we've had a dramatic impact on the city. This is looking eastwards down the Liffey. You can see the various points there in this photograph, but you can essentially see that the city has been moving eastwards. And the reason for that is that the port has been in control since 1707 of the water, the Liffey itself, the quay walls, and out as far as the end of the south wall. Very much the move to the Custom House in the 1790s is the beginning of that, but it kind of shows you there in this painting from about 1830, gives you an idea of how busy it was right up to O'Connell Street. And this gives you a visual impact of how we've dominated the city. The area brown that you see there is the area that's been filled in by the Ballast Office in the 1700s and later organisations. So very much, if you're at Trinity College and you're on the playing fields of Trinity College, in the early 1700s, on a high tide, you'd see the sea. That's all been filled in the whole way in now, down as far as the East Wall Road on the north side, and down to Ringsend. Sorry about that. Down to Ringsend in the south side. And again, that goes back to the physical infrastructure for a city. The bridges were also controlled by the engineers of the port, and they were all built by the engineers up as far as the high tidal mark, which was at Houston Station, or King's Bridge as it was called. And this area around where the point is today was known as the Halpin's Point, and it was the furthest part of the city right up into the 1850s. But 100 years ago, you can see how dominant and how near to the city that the port has become. On the north side, very heavily connected by railways around the country. You could leave Galway on a morning train and find yourself that evening in London, going on express trains to Dublin onto a 3-hour trip over to Holyhead, and then the express down to London. The north side, or sorry, the south side was more an industrial landscape. The Dublin Gas Company dominated down there, and other industries such as that. However, the port went into decline in the 1980s, and it in many ways fell down the pecking order of other ports in the country. Had a lot of industrial disputes, but also this hard section here that I'm pointing at had become very much an area of decay. And the area around our own port centre headquarters is also an area of decay. And this in 1989 was then handed over to a development board that created the modern docklands. And the port moved, as Conor is saying, down very much to the deep water, which is past the East Link Bridge. And modern shipping, that's what ships need. They need depth. And Dublin Port is the only deep water port on the East Coast. And similar to Cork, you need depth of water to get these ships in. So the modern port is very much based on the north side, with some smaller operations on the south side. But we're still very much reliant on the two engineering marvels, the south Bull Wall and the north Bull Wall, which were finalised in 1820, but both walls provide the depth that we need to get ships in, because the whole east coast of Ireland is a very shallow, sandy coast. What these two walls did was create a natural depth down to 7 and 8 metres, which allowed bigger ships to come in. And it's in many ways something that we're still reliant on today. However, our relationships, and this is the point I want to make in looking at the future of port cities, with the local communities had started very badly in the 1970s. A series of massive projects to change the face of Dublin Port were announced quite dramatically. The last one was this one from 1979 to 2010. It was an extension again of the port into the bay. And you can see how close it was going to get to Clontarf and the North Bull area. And this created huge upset within the communities surrounding the port. And in many ways, the port had found itself with a lot of angry neighbours. When we look at the biosphere that was designated in Dublin Bay, you can see now that the port is very much surrounded by nature reserves and the UNESCO designated biosphere. And in 2010, during a court case, More Plan all basically made the point that the port can no longer expand. So the reality is that we are embedded in the city. We can't be expanding into the bay. We're surrounded by nature reserves. So this is a dramatic change because the port in many ways since the 1790s had been moving eastwards, and that had been always the way, fill in. and of course hugely environmentally damaging, and an approach that's not favoured nowadays. However, in 2012, a master plan was announced after a very long process, looking at improving port capacity within the port and not impacting on the nature or the communities around us, but also identified a key problem that we have become disconnected with our city. So developing port city integration is essential, and as Lorna kind of set out in my biography, very much my background is looking at building museums, building areas for people to come into, and that's what the port is now interested into. So a lot of master planning and a lot of these documents you'll find on our website. The most recent one is the Dublin Port post-2040 dialogue, because as Lorna says, there is this kind of demand, move the port and solve housing in Ireland or in Dublin. And of course, that's not going to happen. It's a lot more complicated to move a port, especially on the East Coast, because we don't have the depth of water. So what I recommend, if you have a chance to afterwards to go on to read both documents, but particularly the post-24 dialogue, to see the complexities of moving a port. Like Cork, we've kind of gone through a renaissance. Ours is a bit early. Since 2015, we started to engage in a series of projects to start getting people thinking about the port, but also to kind of learn about the port. In this case, a diving bell, which was used in building many of the quay walls in Dublin in the 19th century, had lain for many years on the quay walls and was lifted up and turned into a museum. That again was explaining and interpreting what was many Dubliners would have passed without understanding what it was. And what we want to do is get people excited about what we as a company have done over in our history. At the same time, around our port centre, our headquarters, we've broken down the walls. So on the East Wall Road, there's a very traditional Victorian wall, and that's been knocked through to allow people to come through. So we're trying to break down what is a physical barrier between the city along the East Wall. It's very much a 4-lane highway, and that divides us from the city. And we're very much encouraging people to come into the garden and the area around the port to experience it and see the city from a different way. In 2019, we took the last Liffey ferry, which had run onto the building of the Eastlink Bridge, has been refurbished, and now, until post the pandemic times, of course, was used as a taxi and ferry across the river. This area where it's working at the moment will later on have pedestrian bridges, but onto those pedestrian bridges, it is the quickest way to get from the Three Arena or the Point Theatre to get across to the south side. Oops. So again, looking at the Port Archive, which is my own background, we have an amazing archive detailing 300 years of history. It's amazing that a company has kept on to this collection. It's particularly a visual collection, 30,000 engineering drawings, but also 70,000 photographs. The engineers from the 1860s photographed everything that they did. So it's spectacular visual delight and one that we can use to explain the links between the port and the city. Working with Grafton Architects since 2019, we've been working with them on creating areas within the port that we can kind of bring visitors into the port. So this is their master map, kind of setting out the green areas, which I'll talk about in a second. But in particular, we've identified the area around the port centre, the old grading dock area, and the Odlums, and now the flour mill area for future areas that we can bring visitors into the port to see what we do. This is kind of a 3D visualization, again, looking east to kind of give you an idea of some of the projects that we have evolving at the moment. Central to that is the idea of a distributed museum, starting off with the diving bell, but then encouraging people to cycle or walk into a new greenway system that we're developing at the moment. The major one at the moment is the Liffey to Talca, 1.4 kilometres long, one that is being developed and going to planning shortly, which will then link in with the Talca Estuary Greenway, which will go down to the end of the port. And again, that is to allow people to see the port in a different way and appreciate it. That's just an idea. Again, a visualization of the Talca Estuary Greenway, kind of give you an idea of its length. And at the end, it'll be a linear park, again, giving a different view to the port. This year, we'll be opening a pump house and grading docks area in the old shipbuilding area of the port, which is part of the first part of the master plan called ABR, the Alexander Basin Redevelopment Area. You can kind of see there the kind of scale of the area. It's a self-contained, separate from the container port area for visitors to come in and experience and learn more about the port. And then the last big project is the flour mill project. The old Odlums area is being redeveloped, and we are preserving those buildings. We're not planning to knock them down, but actually to utilize them and turn them into an area that visitors can experience and learn about the history of Dublin, but also Dublin Port, and also an area for our very important archive. We're very keen to create a maritime archive, which will become a kind of main area of anyone doing any research in Irish maritime history. Port Perspectives is an area that we've moved into, which is again engaging with artists and working with artists. And they're just two of the sample projects that we've kind of run with in the last 5 years and more planned for this year. We also, during COVID, moved online, where we hosted within that heritage zone, the pump house area, 5 plays online in November 2020. Again, engaging a new audience. Due to COVID, we couldn't bring people into the physical buildings. That was a great way to engage with people online. And that's going to be again replicated now that we're coming out of our 3rd lockdown, with the Pump House, the Book of Names by New Productions and Landmark Productions, two amazing theatre companies, where we're going to bring people into the heritage zone to learn more about the port's history during the War of Independence and Civil War period. So based on the research that we have found in the archive. And of course, we keep in contact continuously through the various websites that we have, but in particular on the Port Archive, we have a very active news section and Twitter account. And tonight you'll see that we are coming to an end of a series of lectures that we have on Victorian Dublin's Dublin Port and the diving bell. Jim Keller, my colleague, will be talking about the diving bell. Previously, our Chief Executive, Eamon Reidy, had talked about port city integration. And then the engineering historian, Dr. Ron Cox, had talked about the history of engineering in the port in the 19th century. So hopefully I just came in there at 10 minutes. If you want to contact me, that's my contact details there. And I recommend going to the Dublin Port Archive, and look forward to the questions afterwards.
Thanks very much, Lara. That's really fascinating as well. I'd like to have your job, actually. Could I now introduce Professor Amanda Brandellero from the Erasmus School of History, Culture and Communication in Rotterdam. And I think Rotterdam has been having its own substantial development as well. Amanda is there with us.
Lara, you might stop screen sharing if you don't mind.
As expected, I was having some trouble with my screen, and I cannot share while somebody else is sharing, actually. So I would need the previous speaker to stop sharing their screen.
Okay, yeah, I think that's being sorted out.
And am I out there? I'm off, logged off. Can you go in?
Okay, yeah.
There you go.
So thank you, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to this panel. Before I start talking about giving some examples from the Rotterdam experience with Port City Interface, I would just like to mention that, as Lorna said, I'm part of the Port City Futures Research Centre, which is a collaboration between Leiden, Delft and Erasmus universities. And the idea is to bring people together from very different disciplinary backgrounds, because we feel that Port City challenges require this interdisciplinary perspective. They are so complex that insights from a single discipline may not be enough to fully grasp what needs to happen and to develop visions and imaginaries for the future. And maybe also as part of the some of the issues that port cities face are also a result of compartmentalization of knowledge and policy making. And this is why we also aspire to develop these conversations. So Rotterdam, many of you will be familiar with it, is home to Europe's largest seaport. And over the centuries, the port has developed from a river to a seaport. And work by Thornton and Van der Laar have pointed out to the presence of migration-related phases of port expansion. In other words, the development or how the port developed in the city was very much connected to flows of migration to the city. Today, Rotterdam is a very diverse city where just over half the population has a first or second generation migration background. In my research, as Lorna mentioned, I focus on circular and sustainable making practices in post-industrial contexts. Myself, I'm not a port specialist, but I came to be interested in the port, and in particular the port's retraction from the city when I started working on sustainable making practices in the city of Rotterdam. In Rotterdam, my research has led me to focus on what is happening in the city's Makers District. So on these maps, you see on the one hand the city and the port of Rotterdam, and on the other the Makers District, which is highlighted also in the first map. And if you're familiar with Rotterdam, you'll see that it's very central. It's located just east of the city centre. In the city of Rotterdam, the neighborhoods that are now designated under the umbrella of the Makers District offer a really interesting location to explore how the relationship between the port and the city has evolved over time, and how the city is regenerating its waterfront while also approaching a return of manufacturing to the city. So in what follows, I would like to share some insights of some work that I carried out together with my colleague Maurice Janssen and Rosanne van der Houwelingen at the Erasmus University. The Makers District was designated as such in 2018 and is closely interlinked to the changing relationship between port and city. Historically, this area was a bustling trade, storage, shipyarding node of the city's port activity. And it became part of the city's redevelopment that kicked off early in the 2000s. If you because I'll be talking more about the two areas that are part of the district, the part on the north of the river is M4H, M4H. And it used to be one of the largest fruit ports in the world, whereas the area south to the river, RDM, was a shipbuilding yard. Now, at the turn of the millennium, technological advances made it possible to move many port-related activities out of the area and far out of the city. And this left these harbours hollowed out of their economic foundations. As with many areas, and we've heard some examples in the previous presentations, the retreat of port activities left these areas as what other scholars have referred to ghost districts. They lost not just their economic livelihoods, but also parts of their seaport identities. Today, the Makers District is looking for new opportunities for these areas, coupled with new imaginaries that capture the aspiration for the future, not just of the neighborhoods, but also of the city as a whole. In the Makers District, Rotterdam is articulating its desire to strive to become a heart of innovative manufacturing, and also to incorporate pioneering sectors of artificial intelligence, and to develop interesting and inspiring collaborations between research, business, and education. In these two animated maps that I'm showing, I wanted to show you the changes in jobs in the two areas, and in particular to show the retreat of port-related activities and the popping up of different types of sectors and jobs in the two areas. Now, often port scholars tend to look at port cities as a whole, but what we see in the data is that actually different neighborhoods within the city offer very different opportunities and present different challenges as well. So there is no kind of one-size-fits-all approach to the regeneration of these areas. M4H to the left has become a center of pioneering and artisanal manufacturing firms and also creative firms and companies active in eco-manufacturing, whereas RDM has become a hotspot for innovation in the port, in particular contributing to the city's ambition to develop along the lines of smart port thinking. As the area vision and its implementation unfolds in the Makers District, the maritime identity and water-related heritage values have been highlighted in quite different ways in the two areas. while in the Fearghal to the left, the area has really rebranded itself as an urban makers district, maintaining some links with produce handling, but focusing more towards the city. The area to the south of the river, RDM, is really looking to be an innovative member of Rotterdam's port. Oh, sorry, skipped one. It's interesting also to reflect on questions of reuse of buildings. And again, we've heard some examples in the previous presentation. In my investigation of the area, I was really inspired by the work of Jane Jacobs, who famously said that new ideas need new buildings, innovative ideas are risky, and new dedicated facilities would enhance that risk. And we see this really in action in the Makers Districts. Disused wharf buildings are populated by new users who give the spaces new purposes, functionalities, often with a collaborative ethos. In this picture, I'm showing you an example of one of said shared maker spaces in Fearghal, in the neighborhood north of the river, where we see that small individual firms can rent out spaces and studios to create objects, artworks, etc. But also there are spaces to learn how to repair things, how to make things oneself, and engage in a more sustainable sustainable and less wasteful form of consumption. So to conclude my presentation, I was thinking about, how can we move forward? What does, in particular, the research that is taking place within our Port City Futures Centre, how can it help lead the way for the future for more resilient port cities? Well, I think one of the things that we are trying to do in our research centre is to work on the notion of a maritime mindset, which identifies and understands the areas of tension that arise when thinking about the future of port cities. And I'm thinking here about the tensions between the cruise ships and the residents, between automation and local jobs, between regeneration and gentrification, rising rents and exclusionary practices. How can we find a resolution to these tensions? In our network, we have the ambition to do so by engaging in conversations with stakeholders, by studying, obviously, what is happening on the ground, informing, sharing knowledge. And we do so in a variety of ways through films, blogs, MOOCs, podcasts, and also obviously engaging in more traditional academic activities, writing articles and teaching. But I'm very curious to hear more from the audience, also whether particular forms of knowledge sharing are more useful to you, because this will obviously be very interesting information for us to use and to make sure that the knowledge that we have is more useful and can be used by all of you out there. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Amanda. That was really interesting. So we're going to move on to the discussion and questions and answers element of this now. And just to remind our audience that there's a Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. So any questions that you have, if you want to put them in there, and I will be moving into them fairly shortly. But just first of all, just to address some of the themes that we're addressing in this conference, I just perhaps, Amanda, if I could just pick up on your point there about the research that the Port Cities Future Centre is undertaking and examining some of those tensions that arise. There is a very interesting contribution which Paula Long, I think, sent to all panelists. So I'm just taking it now, even though I know I'm taking questions and answers later, but I think she's summarising something that you referred to there, where she said, it's important for people, both Irish and visitors, to preserve and protect our historical buildings. We need to witness progressive development that respects the legacy of our maritime old city. The story of Cork is not reflected in high-rise generic towers of glass and chrome. It's easily modelled on the limestone and sandstone, which transparently lies at our core. Let's have exciting buildings without raising those which have long sustained and served us. And I suppose I'm based in Galway, and Galway has a plan to expand. So like Conor and Lara were explaining about ports expanding and moving downriver, Galway wants to move out into the bay as well. But as part of its plan, there's a plan to develop some of the land for high-rise buildings. So what people see, what they say to me is, oh, high-rise buildings, cruise ships, bigger ships. Where does this leave the city? How is this connected to the city? Is this more of a sort of a disconnect? And at the same time, there's all the language about in relation to climate change, about sustainability, but what does that actually mean? So, you know, when you're having some of those, when you're doing that research on those tensions, have you come up with any solutions? Big question.
That's a very good question. Well, I think it's important to understand who the stakeholders are first and get people in a conversation. I mean, obviously, this is not really the place for researchers to become to get these conversations started, but there are very interesting formats like developing living labs where people can come together and co-create a solution. But I think if I think of my research, what has often frustrated in particular residents is that sometimes you know, they get involved in conversations and then actually the outcomes don't translate fully into solutions. I think I can really recognize many of the tensions that you mentioned. I mean, even in the Makers District that I described, I mean, it sounds like a brilliant idea that is also very much embracing principles of sustainability and circularity. But even there, with many houses that need to be built in Rotterdam, we are starting to see the tensions arising between the need to maybe shift some of the area to high value uses and residential versus maybe keeping some of these collective spaces for creation where people can also learn how to make, repair, and reuse materials and objects. So, well, I don't have a solution yet, but keep watching the space of our center, and hopefully very shortly we will have more tools to also guide discussions and help find solutions.
Right, okay. Thank you very much. And Conor, just in relation to your plan for Cork, I presume that you have climate proof that, I mean, sea level rise and all that sort of thing. You've factored all that in. Oh,
absolutely. Yeah. That very simple answer from us. Certainly, the answer is yes. And in fact, planning, ports are all about long-term planning, as we know. And so we are currently in the midst of our 2050 plan, taking into account not just climatic impact, rising sea levels and such, but also on the other end of the business, the capacity constraints that we face as we see Ireland grow, and how the Port of Cork needs to be in a position to support that in terms of trade and all manner of trade. And not just the other, we've mentioned cruise. Cruise keeps getting mentioned. You know, I know you've mentioned in Galway, and indeed it is a topic all the time. You know, the concept of cruise coming in and disgorging loads of tourists, and we've seen some really bad stories from the likes of Barcelona in particular, and certainly we've visited Amsterdam and indeed and other areas, and Dublin. I know that Lara may expand now, and that they've made decisions around cruise, but the sustainability of cruise in particular is hugely important, and so from the Port of Cork's perspective, and I maybe just expand on that a bit, because it has a huge impact, positive impact on the local business and society, because let's not forget what cruise is about. It's about giving long-term tourists a short-term taste of what a country's about, a day, and so from that perspective, sustainable tourism is both not just in terms of the environmentally sustainability, but also in terms of the commercial sustainability. So from the Port of Cork's perspective, we are looking at all of those pieces, and trying to manage them all and all those moving parts.
And do you think cruise ships do you think that will make a recovery? Yeah,
I do. What that recovery will look like is something that would be very interesting. Certainly this COVID has hit many industries badly, but none more so than cruise. To this day, cruise is banned from returning to Ireland, and we won't see a return of cruise vessels in any way until 2022. But that impact has hit the larger cruise companies very badly. We've seen them take out significant loans to underpin their business and try and survive. And what the cruise industry will look like in the coming years, I don't know. It may move towards smaller vessels, more expedition style vessels, more niche sector. But there were a lot of larger vessels that were being built. So what does one do with those larger vessels and such? But the sustainability aspect of cruise is something that is ever present, and particularly acute in the minds of cruise operators. Like for the Port of Cork, for example, we will be constrained in the number of vessels we can take. We're keenly aware of the impact on the community. So when we look at cruise, we look at how it impacts on the local community, particularly in Cove and indeed Bantry, where we are going at the moment. But I do think we'll see a return of cruising, and I think it's a very important component part of the tourist industry.
And do you think generally that, you know, if we hopping around here now to Suez, are ships too big? Are we building ships too big?
I don't think we're building ships too big. The reason those ships are so big is we're following that hub and spoke model, where we see those large vessels like the one you've mentioned in cruise, the 20,000, 22,000 TEU vessels, the larger Lolo vessels, servicing the hubs in Amanda's area in Rotterdam, and then the feeder vessels operating out of the smaller ports in the like we have out of Ireland. What we've done in the Port of Cork is move down to deep water so that we can get in here, and we believe that's a good way to go. We are serviced by those feeder vessels as are Dublin and indeed Belfast, Felixstowe or Southampton, or indeed on the continent, Rotterdam. But we've already developed the larger vessels to support transatlantic trade, and that's where we've seen this move earlier about a transatlantic link of a Panamax style vessel of 4,000 TEU. So that'll be interesting to see. There's certainly a move towards maybe trading more locally than the deeper sea trades, and that's something that may emerge. But I think that will take a little bit more time to manifest itself in global trade patterns.
Right, okay. And Lar, just in terms of Dublin's own master plan, then obviously Board Pleanála ruling, that meant that there was going to be no more reclamation plans, but that probably wouldn't have happened now anyway, would it, in relation to, the government's own climate plan and projections for sea level rise?
Yeah, it wouldn't, of course, now. But as I said in the talk, I mean, the reality is that we are surrounded by nature reserves, and that was the decision, and it was the case made by the local communities. And it was the right case to make at the time. And like Cork, like Conor was saying, I mean, with what we're doing at the moment is improving rebuilding quay walls. They haven't been touched in over 100 years, and that's about improving capacity. And when the engineers are doing that, they're also elevating and bringing up the quay walls to deal with climate change. And then the company itself has put buoys into the bay to start getting scientific information. And the 2018 storms showed that it's not just the climate change, but it's the violence of the storms, that the storms and the wave height within Dublin Bay is getting higher. So in the case of the storm it was March 2018, one of the smaller harbours that we look after in the Bay, Cork Harbour, was badly damaged due to the storms. So that's again just the force of the waves. So we're very much alert to the climate change, very much alert to the environment around us. Work very closely with Birdwatch Ireland. So it's my own background is heritage, so I look after, that's my focus and was the focus of my talk. But we're fully engaged with environmental and also with the animals that surround us within the port. Just going back to Conor's point about cruises, we went out for consultation in 2018 to look at the cruise business in Dublin, and it's a very good document if you want to see it on our website, because it kind of shows what Conor was describing there. Is you have people who really passionate about having cruises because of the economic benefits, but there's also an equally kind of growing group who are very, very concerned environmentally about cruising. And I think the document kind of reflects both sides of the argument. And then I actually spent my honeymoon on a cruise ship 20 years ago, when they were a lot smaller. They've got very, very big since. But sadly, recently we've had to kind of talk to the cruise companies and say that we've had to, for next year, as Conor said, this year, the ban on ships, is that we won't be able to take in as many ships as we had hoped, because of an impact of Brexit, because the Ocean Pier, which is the main pier, is our longest pier, also is the main pier for the bigger ships coming in from Europe. So CLDN, which are now going to Cork, are when I started here, we're having 6 sailings a week. In 2017, they're now up to 14 separate sailings a week. So the scale of the connectivity now with Europe in light of Brexit is colossal, and the one good size quay that we have is now kind of in full use. And these ships that are coming in are the biggest ro-ro ships in Europe. We've got 8 kilometers of trailers on board, and that means 8 kilometers has to be taken off and 8 kilometers has to be put back onto the ship. So it's a big operation. So the days of having space for something like in Rotterdam market, I mean, what the port has at the moment is, all the land is being used except the areas that I've described as kind of identified as heritage areas.
Right. Okay. Actually, going back to you, Conor, on that climate theme, how will renewable fuels, such as green hydrogen, change the shipping industry and ports? And could Ireland beat the Netherlands in the race to provide this infrastructure for the Atlantic? There you go.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure if we could beat the Netherlands. No, we can beat them. I don't even know if we could beat them in football. But I mean, but on a serious point, in terms of renewables, it's absolutely a hugely important area for us from the Port of Cork and every other port. And I know indeed Rotterdam and indeed Amsterdam ports in the Netherlands are very well advanced in this area. For us, for the Port of Cork, there's huge opportunities, particularly in floating offshore wind. So we're going to see Ireland develop its presence in that area. The Port of Cork is very well positioned to support both the assembly and the assembly and then deployment of those offshore wind pieces of equipment. But also then, once that's deployed and effectively, we have a long-term future then in supporting them as an M&O port, similar to the North Sea ports, and supporting the offshore oil and gas industry. And from the Port of Cork's perspective, we're very well positioned to support that, not just geographically, but because of port itself, its skill sets, because of the National Maritime College and UCC in terms of their various capabilities in supporting that. And so we have skill sets, we have the labour force, we have certainly we have government support in this, so you'll see a huge drive behind that from green initiatives and support. And I think over the next 7 to 10 years, we're going to see the Port of Cork in particular develop its presence and capability in supporting the offshore renewable industry. The one thing I would say about it, though, is it's not the only show in town. And so the Port of Cork will take a measured approach. As we move towards net zero, which is hugely important, there is the fossil fuel element that will support that transition fuel piece. So we have the Barry Row field, which may be exploited. We also have Whitegate, which is Ireland's largest oil refinery, and Borgosh. And in Bantry, we have the Nora oil reserve. So as we move towards net zero, we can't forget the fact that we have to do it in a measured way. And the Port of Cork will keep that uppermost in its minds as we develop our commercial presence in that area.
Right, okay. I will start, the questions are coming in thick and fast, but we're also talking about the migration and mobility themes as part of this conference. And you've all referred to population rise. We had a very cruel reminder this week, the body of that little boy from a Kurdish family washed up on the Norwegian coast. And that's a reminder of the boy Aylan Kurdi and those images and the migration crisis and how it's just gone from the news during COVID. I mean, just very periodic flashes of it. But we have migration, which is going to be exacerbated by climate change. The Syrian conflict started due to climate change. So we're going to have a lot of mobility. We haven't much direct experience of it here in Ireland because of our geographical position. We have sent Navy ships down to the Mediterranean. But you know, going fast forward, how are ports preparing for this? And in terms of, you know, migration, population growth and diversity. Perhaps I could go to you, Lar, first.
No, definitely. It's a huge change that's coming to, I think at this stage, about 14-15% of the Irish population is born outside Ireland. So Ireland is changing quite dramatically. And when we talk about arranging or organising a port museum, there's two strands that we want to engage with. One is this migration, as you say, a lot's going to come, and they're saying will develop over the years due to dramatic climate change in other countries, and to kind of raise that as an issue. Within our local communities in East Wall, the Docklands area, you know, the population is changing quite dramatically, less so in the East Wall area and Ringsend, but in particular the new buildings that have been built between the Custom House down to the East Wall Road. It's taken 30 years to build them all. The last one is going to start building this year, but that means that we have a very large population, a large number of them working for the big software companies, and it's a huge international community. So we're quite keen to engage with them and talk to them and see you know, how we can interact with them. And the other element that we want to put into it, the Port Museum, is this idea that, you know, in Ireland we produce, you know, we produce stuff, it's agricultural, but you know, now we're very heavily reliant on international finance and on software companies. But the reality is huge amounts of material are imported into Ireland. In many ways, if you're at home in your sitting room, you know, the furniture at some stage was on a container. Most definitely all the electronic goods. So that's something that we want to kind of engage with people and kind of people kind of think, where is the stuff coming? Because as an island nation, we are very reliant on everything coming in, just as you said. And the Chief of Staff, current Chief of Staff of the Defence Forces, as when he was in charge of Naval Services, talked about this kind of concept of sea blindness. Sometimes in Ireland, we kind of forget that everything has to come in on a truck. And since Ryanair kind of started flying us out off the island in the early 90s, you know, no one comes to the port really to kind of take a ferry unless you're driving. While when I was a teenager, it was kind of a rite of passage that you went to England or you went to Europe on boat, and it was normally a horrific experience on those smaller boats. But the point I'm making is that, you know, people have lost a link with their ports. They have in Ireland. I think we have an unusual relationship with the water that surrounds us, and that's for historical reasons. So they're the things that we would like to tackle in a port museum. It's not just a dry narrative of the port and the company, the history of Dublin. It needs to kind of engage with a bigger, you know, where are we going from here?
Right, okay. Thank you. And Amanda, in your research, is migration and mobility, is that a theme of your own research?
Not of my own research, but obviously Rotterdam, as I said before, is a very diverse city. We have over 50% of its population has a migrant background. The population includes like 180 different nations. So the kind of urban model of the city is is like a cosmopolitan incubator, shall we say. And some of the challenges that maybe I would add to what has just previously been said is that what we've also seen in Rotterdam has been a growing sense of polarization reflected in the rise of right-wing populist parties. Rotterdam had a right-wing party called Livable Rotterdam, Leefbaar Rotterdam, which was quite popular a couple of years ago, and also other populist parties have also been quite important in recent years. And so this also shows how, you know, there is also a need to address these issues from a political level and to try and find solutions to bring people closer together rather than to enhance or reproduce these forms of segregation and confrontation between different groups. So these are the challenges that are faced in the city that I live in, and maybe these are also recognizable in some other places in this meeting today. I'm curious to hear other experiences.
Right, and actually one of the questions that came in, somebody's very interested to know in relation to the living labs and engaging local communities in the port area. Would you have some specific examples of that?
Yes, I mean, there are some examples, for instance, in designing solutions to specific neighborhood challenges. You know, how do you green your neighborhood, or how do you start recycling schemes that involve everyone, even people who maybe don't tend to follow the instructions or pay attention to these things. And there are some very interesting co-creation examples also in circular neighborhoods, not far from Rotterdam, in the city of The Hague, called the Binkhorst, where again, there is an attempt to look at circularity or sustainability as being really something that takes and involves a whole neighborhood rather than individual firms and individual stakeholders, and trying to see how everyone can together play a role in helping also other people to be more activated and to be part of the process. And so there are some very interesting examples coming up from these contexts, quite local contexts. So, I mean, I think the challenge is then trying to bring that up to a city level.
And who hosts the Living Labs? I mean, is it the port, or is it the city, or?
The ones I'm familiar with are, one was organized by an association which is accelerating the adoption of circular economy in the south of the Netherlands. And another was at a neighborhood level. But I mean, we've also had Living Labs arranged by the university, trying to, you know, do some thinking about how to resolve a particular challenge that is encountered maybe by students or by a researcher in their work. So I think there are many opportunities to just set these conversations, these innovative spaces for creation in very different ways and contexts.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So there's a comment here, and I don't know if any of you want to respond to this. The speakers have brought economics, heritage, arts, tourism, and creative industries into port recovery, resilience, renaissance. What about a role for sports and recreation? Lara, maybe you have something to say on that.
Well, with the greenway system that we're building into the fringes of the port, I mean, this will be a walking. The idea is, again, for people to walk and cycle for recreation in these areas. When it comes to swimming, I'm not sure the port area would be suitable for that, but the port is surrounded by very, very lovely beaches. And also, again, there's a large amount of sports and recreation clubs in Ringsend and in Clontarf along the fringes of Dublin Bay. So, and we work closely with a lot of those clubs, especially ones nearest to us. So within the port itself, it's mainly going to be running, walking, and cycling, because that's the nature of the areas that we're looking at. But I think the simple answer is yes, it would be great to have more of it.
Right, okay. And Conor, have you got any plans in Cork?
Yeah, not in terms of, I suppose, infrastructure investment and such like that, but what we do, we have always done and continue to do, is we actively sponsor and support the leisure industry in Cork Harbour. So we'll be a very significant supporter of the sporting aspect of the leisure industry. And we've now moved away from scattergun sponsorship and of broad charities and such, into supporting and investing money in local communities that are affected by the harbour, by the Port of Cork in the harbour. And amongst supporting local based charities and such, on the sporting side, we support the rowing clubs that are in the river, and anything that's marine based orientated, we tend to provide sponsorship for. So from that perspective, certainly, on the infrastructure, we just haven't had an opportunity as yet to make those type of investments.
Right. And just, Conor, going back to the cruise ships, there's a comment here. In some Spanish ports, we see big cruises arrive, but they don't really have a positive impact on local communities. Visitors are taken in pre-packed experience through very specific tourist enclaves, Cliffs of Moher, and they don't stay around in local smaller shops, restaurants, etc. Do the ports of Cork, Dublin, Rotterdam have the same problem? And if so, are you doing something about it? I mean, I suppose if you don't even have to think of cruise ships, you think of tour buses in Galway, and they just go to set places.
Well, we've actually put a lot of effort into it, because we were keenly aware for a long period of time that is what was happening. The cruise vessels would come alongside, the tour buses would turn up, and the passengers would get in the buses and go off for their day trips and stuff. But what we've put a lot of effort into, working alongside both the city and county councils, and indeed the tourist operators and the cruise lines, is to broadening out that experience. So now it's a half day. They do, passengers have the choice, but most of them do get on a bus and go and look at a destination. But then what we have seen, and we've strongly seen in the last 5 to 7 years, they now spend a half day in the receiving point. In our case, it's in Cove, and we've seen the huge improvement in Cove and its businesses and its vibrancy. And just to maybe articulate the point, because we've done a lot of research on it, the average cruise passenger that comes in the Cork area spends about €85 when they go ashore in the local community. The average crew person spends just under €30 in the local community. And we encourage actively through tourist guides, which are supported by both the city and county, for them to not just get on the excursions, which is an important component part, but also to find their way around Cove, or to find their way into Cork City, or indeed find their way around Bantry. So we were aware of it, and we've put a lot of effort into that. And that's it. So that model is we believe, sustainable for us.
Right. So I'm sorry, I'm not going to get to all the questions now, but I'll move as fast as I can. So for a question for Dublin Port, the solutions to, or possible solutions to, mitigation of congestion, which is limiting rail freight integration, and then also linking rail to the Port of Cork post-COVID, and in the light of Brexit, that displacement of trade routes away from the Dublin.
Sure.
In
relation to rail in Dublin, we do have trains coming in, about between 4 and 6 trains a day. The main customers are Coca-Cola coming from Ballina. The syrup is exported from Ireland. And then Tara Mines in County Meath, all their zinc ore. Ireland has the biggest zinc ore mine in Europe, is exported from Dublin Port, and they're brought in by train. So again, huge numbers of trucks taken off the road for those. As it's about 1% though of the overall business, so it is still quite small, and the port is quite keen to work with Irish Rail in developing and increasing that load coming into the port. However, I mean, I think, again, from just Irish Rail's point of view, I think the nature of the railway system, it's a 19th century rail system, and there are pinch points throughout the network which kind of reduce how many goods trains compared to passenger trains can actually be used. But the port, as I say, is quite keen to have more trains.
Right, yeah. And Conor, that link. And I know Captain McKenna in Dublin Port thinks that land bridge is going to recover. The land bridge traffic is going to recover. But so where's that going to leave all your new shipping routes?
I totally respect Captain McKenna's view on that. I'm wrong. But I think, and maybe just on the rail front, because it's interesting, because we've opened a flagship facility in Marina Point, which has rail access, and we haven't closed the door on the concept of rail freight movement. The problem is the economics around it, particularly in a country as small as Ireland, and so it has to be economically. So, but it's not. We haven't closed the door on it. Interestingly, moving away from the freight piece, there was an announcement only last week by the minister that our Tivoli land bank will see a rail stop put in place, and that will support that urban regeneration area. In terms of the links to Europe, certainly the links that we put in place in the last 18 months are Conor, and so there's no real rail component to it. But irrespective of the improvement in the land bridge and the customs improvements and such, I'm not convinced of that fully. I think you'll see an element of a return to land bridge, but what we're seeing is a shift away from a driver accompanied to unaccompanied freight, and we'll also see a move away from trade patterns and trading patterns directly with route to market and trading directly with Europe. And so I think what we're going to see is more of an unaccompanied freight, more sustainable freight connections between Cork and indeed Rosslare and Europe. And also, don't forget, Dublin has significant congestion issues. And so it's important that both Rosslare and Cork help Dublin with those congestion issues by supporting more trade out of our ports. I'm sure Lara will on that.
Thank you, Conor. Well, I have been the historian. I agree with Captain McKenna, with Conor. But as a historian, I'd kind of wait until the end of the year to see what the impact of Brexit is. It's probably a bit too early to kind of say definitively what's going to happen. But as I said in my talk, I mean, the links with Europe are just multiplying, and it is unaccompanied traders that seems to see the increase. But if you come back to us in December, hopefully we'll have an answer what was the impact of Brexit. As it is, I didn't mention, I mean, and like with all the ports, and with these European links, but also particularly with the British links, huge infrastructure is being put in by the Office of Public Works to build facilities, so that Brexit can be dealt with by customs and by revenue and agriculture. So the facilities have been built, which has been very, very impressive to see. But maybe wait until December before we have a final answer.
And of course, that nightmare scenario described today on Morning Ireland, where we could have just checks right throughout Ireland if this whole Northern Ireland Protocol issue wasn't resolved. So there's a good question here, this concept of the 15-minute city in terms of logistics and transport, and if ports can, like Dublin and Cork, can facilitate that. And then there's another question here about maybe Cork having a network of passenger ferries, serving points, across that beautiful harbour. Like Sydney, which has an extensive ferry network linked to its public transport system.
Certainly from the Port of Cork's perspective, we're very much in favour of that. We're actually currently talking to a number of outfits that are looking at it, and it does need infrastructure investment. I mean, it is a beautiful harbour. It does need more points whereby we can run those types of ferries. But I think into the future, we will see an emergence of those ferries. Port of Cork is certainly in favour of supporting.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I'm just there's quite a few more questions here, and I just hope I'm not leaving anyone else. Donna Horgan, he's talking about the unique position of Cork within a wider ecosystem. Do we have an additional duty of care to the built environment and the port in this? And I know you did talk about that, Conor, but
in what respect?
I presume that you're talking about existing buildings. I mean, you did sell on, didn't you? You did sell on your main.
We did, yeah. We sold the Customs House, which was our traditional headquarters home. I was quite sad myself to leave my beautiful wood-panelled turn-of-the-century office. But we've sold it to a company called Terra Holdings, and their plans for this, which they discussed with us before we signed to sell it, are really quite exciting. So the Customs Office, the Customs House will be maintained. It's beautiful boardroom maintained, and the building itself will be enhanced. Certainly, it'll be a luxury hotel. There's no doubt about that, with high rise. But what their plans for rejuvenating, particularly the Brandellero house, which, as I mentioned, were built by Napoleonic prisoners, and rendering them modern and food and beverage, and indeed an interpretive centre. A historic interpretive centre, which I know are part of the plans, would really help revitalise the centre of the city. And it's not something the Port of Cork would have had the wherewithal to do. So I think from that perspective, it's very exciting, and I think they'll do it in a very tasteful manner.
Right. And then we're in the EU digital decade. What are Cork and Dublin's plans for digitalisation of the ports? Lara, do you have anything?
No, I think Cork has more advanced digitalisation project than we have at the moment, from what I've heard.
Yeah, Conor.
But we'll have to deal with.
Yeah.
Well,
I mean, yeah, certainly digitalisation is the future. There's no doubt about that. And I think from the Port of Dublin's initiatives, or either a Port of Cork's initiatives, are either on digitalisation, or they either concern better control and management of the port, or port infrastructure, or it revolves around insight into the efficiency of logistics. An example being we're in place a vehicle booking system to ensure that the haulage in and out of our new modern container terminal is far quicker. That's a good example of digitalisation. But I definitely think that digitalisation will be at the core of all modern ports, and maybe Rotterdam certainly is. We actually asked Rotterdam to come and carry out an audit of the Port of Cork, as they are the world leaders in digitalisation. And we didn't come out too badly, but certainly we're not in the same league as Rotterdam, but we'll get there.
Right, okay. And Amanda, just in Rotterdam, when you were talking, just going back to those tensions and people feeling excluded, does Rotterdam have a particular experience of that, or do people feel Rotterdam, they feel much more connected to the sea and the port because of the nature of it?
That's an interesting question. I think what we see is that Rotterdam has obviously a large port, but it's still second city in the Netherlands, and there's a lot of competition also with Amsterdam in terms of image. Amsterdam is a cultural hub, a hub for leisure. I mean, there was a question on leisure and sports, and Rotterdam has always felt it's kind of coming second, even though it has such a prestigious and important port. But I think there's been a change in recent years, and in some ways the Eurovision Festival also helped the morale. I'm sorry Ireland didn't do so well. We also didn't do very well in that. But I mean, we kind of see quite some initiatives that try to engage with this pride of being Rotterdam, which is something that I think that at city level we've been struggling with in the past. There is also a counter movement though, because we were on, Lonely Planet, of one of the coolest destinations quite recently, and then there was a backlash. Well, we don't actually want tourists here. We want off the radar. So there are again these tensions emerging. I think there is no solution that makes everyone happy, but you can see this sense of pride, also of reclaiming the past. As a strong trend in the past years, and hopefully a positive one.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you very much. Well, we're sort of running out of time, but I just really want to thank the panelists, Conor Mowlds, Amanda Brandellero and Lorna Joye. And I would like to thank the organisers, UCC and the Cork Harbour Festival. And I'm just reminded, the late maritime historian, Dr. John de Courcy Ireland, said that given its wonderful natural harbour and its deep water, that Cork should really have been the capital of Ireland. But you didn't need to hear that from John de Courcy Ireland. So thank you very much. I'm sorry that I didn't get to all the questions, but I hope people feel that we did cover all the topics. We've had really wonderful input, and thank you all for attending this afternoon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.